Hi, I'm Dawn Clarke, Lettings Director at Nock Deighton. This is the first of a series of podcasts we're going to be doing all about letting property. First of all, you might find that a lot of buy-to-let properties and a lot of properties that you see on the market on Rightmove are sort of very modern properties and sort of similar layout and similar style. We're here, first of all, to demonstrate that you can let a property of any age and any size. Not any property will make a good buy-to-let investment, but there are some properties which people have lived in before and they want to let just because they're moving out of the area. And so we would generally call them accidental landlords. But today we're going to talk about what minimum requirements you need in order to let your property, however old it is. And what better to do that is to find an old property to actually talk through the different things that you need to do and the legal requirements in order to let you out your property. So the first thing I want to talk about is an EPC. Every rental property has to have an EPC in order to let it at the point of marketing, but also we need to comply with the minimum energy efficiency standards. So for all rental properties, the EPC has to be a minimum rating of E. So it starts with an A, which you might find in a sort of a new build property where it's very well insulated and heated, and it goes all the way down to a G. But for rental properties, it needs to be an E. So to take into account all of the elements that go into an EPC, then the energy assessor will look at the structure of the walls, whether there's any loft insulation, whether there's any double glazed windows, the type of heating system, but also with this particular property that we're looking at today, things like open fires need to be considered, because the energy assessor will look at the information and they'll say, well, okay, there's a central heating system, but also there's an open fire. So what the EPC takes into account is that if that fire is open and there's a chimney there, then the heat comes straight out of the radiator and goes up the chimney. So it actually has an adverse effect on the EPC rating. So what I would advise in this particular property, if the chimney is not to be used, if the EPC hasn't been done, then to actually get a chimney balloon or to block off the chimney in order to increase the EPC rating. This particular property has an EPC rating of D, so that's perfectly acceptable to comply with current legislation. The next thing I need to talk about is an electrical safety certificate. Legislation came into effect a couple of years ago stating that all rental properties need to have an electrical installation condition report carried out every 5 years. So the electrician needs to come in and test all the electrics and make sure that the consumer unit is up to date, and also to check all the wiring within the property, all the light fittings and the sockets and everything else throughout. So we need to supply a copy of that certificate to the tenant before the property is let as well. So this is another important factor and a check that you need to do before you let your property out. So kitchens. Obviously, if you've got a nice modern kitchen in your rental property, then that is the ideal solution, as people like to see modern kitchens and enough storage space. But we'll talk about appliances as well. So our advice when you rent out a property is to have to leave the cooker in place. Obviously, make sure it's clean and in good working order. But when it comes to other appliances, things like dishwashers and fridge freezers, then if you're prepared to maintain them throughout the tenancy, then yes, obviously leave them. And also they must be pat tested if they've got a plug on them. But if you don't want to maintain appliances, if you're a landlord, then it's best to take them out. Rather than, we get some landlords who say, well, I'll leave them in there for the use of the tenant, but I don't want to maintain them, which always causes problems a little bit later on down the line. So our advice is, if you don't want to maintain the appliances, take them out. People will bring in their own appliances. So the next certificate you need when renting out your property, if there are any gas appliances within the property, you need a landlord's gas safety certificate. This is needed before you actually let it, because you need to provide a copy of that certificate to your tenant before they move in. So any central heating boilers, any gas fires or any gas appliances throughout the property will need to be checked and needs to be listed on that certificate. Ideally, have your boiler serviced as well, because that will reduce the maintenance going forward. But the legislation requires that you do need to have a gas safety check done, and it needs to be done by a registered gas safe engineer. The other point I want to make here is always provide instructions for any appliances that you have, that you leave within a property. So for the boiler, for cooker or any other appliances that you leave, always make sure that you've got the user manual there available for tenants to use. And finally, while we're in this utility room, I'll mention this carbon monoxide alarm. New regulations came into effect last year requiring carbon monoxide alarms to be placed in every room that has a combustible appliance. So that applies to central heating boilers, gas fires. It doesn't actually apply to gas cookers, but boilers and fires, you need to have a carbon monoxide alarm placed between 1 and 3 metres from that appliance. And it also applies to rooms which have open fires and wood burners. They also need to have one of these alarms placed in there. Ideally, if you can fit it against a wall, perfect, but if not, it's just within that same area, and ideally at sort of head height as well. Open fires and wood burning stoves are always very attractive in any property, including rental properties as well. It's a landlord's responsibility to have the chimney swept before a tenant moves into the property, before the property is let. So always have it done and cleaned out beforehand, and that way you can make sure that it's done by the tenant when they move out of the property. So the last piece of legislation I'm going to talk about with renting properties is smoke alarms. So as well as needing a carbon monoxide alarm for all rooms with a gas appliance or open fires and wood burners, it's a landlord's responsibility to make sure that smoke alarms are installed and working on every floor of the property. So with an older property like this, you've also got a cellar down below. You need a smoke alarm in there if it's classed as a room. In the hallway, obviously on the landing, on the top floor, you need at least one smoke alarm to be installed in every in every floor of the property. I'm also going to talk to you about the importance of having an inventory with a rental property. Whether the property is old or new, and regardless of the amount of furniture that's in there, so if it's completely empty, it is still important to have an inventory carried out, because that is a clear record of everything that's in the property, but also the condition of the property when it's rented out. It's protection for the landlord, it's also protection for the tenant when you record the condition of the property. For instance, here you've got this beautiful old staircase and this lovely decorative balustrade. So if that's not noted in the first place, you don't know whether, what condition it's in, or, whether there's any spindles missing. It's important to have all that detail and photographed and recorded right at the beginning of the property, of the tenancy, and get the tenant to sign a copy of it so you've got that record. It helps if there's any claims on the deposit, but as I said, it also protects the tenant to make sure that we know exactly what it's like when the tenancy begins. So let's talk about decor. Obviously, if you're renting a property from scratch and you're preparing it right from the beginning, then the best way to let a property is to have a blank canvas and have neutral colours. However, that might not always be convenient for a landlord to completely redecorate a property before it's let out. So obviously any property can be let, as we know. But you may find that a tenant who is moving in, it might not suit their colour schemes and what they're bringing into the property. So be prepared for a tenant to ask, can I decorate? I love the property, but some things are not suitable, so can I decorate? So just have that sort of thought in your head to start with if you're going to allow the tenant to decorate. Obviously, if they can make it their own home and you want to let it long term, then best advice really is to say yes, providing it's maybe in neutral colours, or providing you leave the property as the same way as you found it, but something to consider beforehand. Quick bit of advice on gardens. If your property that you're going to be letting has got a lovely big garden, which is well maintained with lovely borders, then it's important to remember that not everyone is a keen gardener. So if you want to keep that property maintained to a good standard, then it's best to get a quotation from a local gardener and maybe think about having it included within the rent. So this concludes my short video on renting out your property, which demonstrates that any property can be let as long as you're compliant with current regulations. There will be more videos to follow about different aspects of rental properties and property management, so watch this space. In the meantime, if you need any advice, then give me a call on 07967 209011. Thank you very much.